In the wildlands beyond the frontier that guarded civilization, word spread amongst the settled barbarian tribes living there that a race of men hitherto unknown had now arisen from a hidden nook of the earth, like a tempest of snows from the high mountains, and was seizing or destroying everything in its way. Reports put their origin far to the north, near the icebound ocean, their existence the product of a union between witches and unclean spirits. They spoke no language save one which bore slight resemblance to human speech. Chroniclers spoke of their bizarre, inhuman appearance and their cruelty, in which they exceed every degree of savagery. In some ways they did not seem human at all, but a force of nature like a whirlwind. Terror at the sweeping arrival of these strangers set all the settled barbarians in these lands in motion, rather like a break shot in pool. The tribes looked for a home removed from all knowledge of the savages, and after long deliberations settled on the land to the south behind the militarized frontier of the state that presided over it for two reasons, both because it had a very fertile soil and because it is separated by that frontier from the fields that were already exposed to the thunderbolts of a foreign war. This sequence of events, only ever glimpsed partially in the perspective of those from the settled and literate polities to the south whose accounts are written down, will be familiar to the readers of the A Song of Ice and Fire series. This sounds like the story of the wildling migration who, after the re-emergence of the supernatural threatened the others, move in vast numbers to seek shelter behind the wall of Westeros. But, as you've no doubt guessed, this is not in fact Westeros, but the barbarian land of Scythia in the late 4th century, what is now called the Pontic-Caspian steppe, separated from the civilized Roman Empire by the limes, the militarized frontier which here followed the mighty flood of the Hister, the Monday Danube. This was the sequence of events that led directly to the Gothic War of 376 AD, to one of the greatest Roman military defeats at the Battle of Adrianople and the death of the Emperor Valens, considered watershed moments in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It's clear these real historical events provided George R. R. Martin inspiration for the storyline we've seen play out so far in the 5 published books. And so I believe that if we can examine these parallels and ask ourselves what narrative and thematic effect our author is using them to achieve, we can see how that parallel might continue to inspire the author in future installments. Let's be clear, however, the author is not writing a historical novel. He is under no obligation to follow how historical events played out with his own story, and is so free at any time to change character decisions, events, locations, outcomes, chronologies, or even to combine inspiration from any number of different sources, historical, contemporary, or fictional. Therefore, if we believe a plot point in the published work was inspired by an event from real-world history, that does not mean that the next fictional plot point that occurs will necessarily be the same as whatever happened next in the equivalent historical period. Indeed, in most cases of historical inspiration for this series, that is not the case. However, that being said, if we are able to establish there is a continuing narrative purpose for a continuing parallel, if continuing to parallel those events serves that same narrative purpose, then what happened next in the fictional world will look a lot like what has already happened in real history. So looking at those historical events can give us insight into how the future of the fictional narrative will play out. Anyone who has read A Song of Ice and Fire will probably already be familiar with the idea that the wall that divides the north of Westeros from the lands beyond it is inspired by Hadrian's Wall, the frontier defences that traditionally have marked the boundary between Roman Britain and the tribal areas of more temporary and tenuous Roman control beyond that in modern-day Scotland. And this dynamic of a militarised frontier between the civilised world and the barbarian north existed all across the northern frontier of the empire from Britain to modern-day Romania, intersecting with the perceived wild areas beyond it: Scotland, the dark forest of Germania, the Carpathian Mountains, and the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which are all in some ways analogous to the lands beyond the wall in Westeros. The militarized frontier zones that face this were known as the limes, literally the limits of the empire, which have traditionally been fixed at Hadrian's Wall, the Rhine River in Germany, and the Danube running across much of Central and Eastern Europe. That's not to say these were strictly fixed borders like we might think of with a modern nation-state. Imperial structures and trade networks might spread out beyond these limits in a Romanized frontier zone, and territorial control fluctuated, such as in the case of the Trans-Danubian province of Dacia, which was conquered by Trajan but abandoned by the time of the late 3rd century. What is important is that dynamic of the militarized frontier between the settled and literate world of the empire and the barbarian world beyond. The limes were the wall of the Roman Empire in Europe. a dynamic common in this time not only to Rome, but also to Persia and China. The danger that was perceived by the settled and literate polities from the nomadic groups outside their frontiers is talked about by Michael Kulikowski in Imperial Tragedy. They were perceived as always ready to pounce when their imperial neighbours lost their vigilance. This dynamic was perpetuated into the later Christianized Roman Empire and medieval Europe, which retained quasi-imperial conceptions of Christendom and its frontiers with the barbaric pagan groups beyond. On the eastern frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, where the emperors fought furiously against pagan Saxons, Slavs, Poles, Wends, and later Islamic Turks, and similarly the crusading order of the Teutonic Knights, which fought their own frontier wars on the edge of Christendom, taking holy vows of chastity and poverty and ranging into the gross wilderness, the great wilderness that was the pagan forest region to the east of their chain of fortresses in modern-day Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. Like in the fictional world of Westeros, this frontier became the scene for conflict in the late 4th century. Emperor Valens, the brother and eastern co-emperor of Valentinian I, after an internal power struggle with the usurper Procopius, campaigned north of the Danube between 367 and 369 AD against the Goths, who had been aligned with Procopius. We can see clearly here the classically Roman trope of an imperial candidate campaigning against barbarians on the frontiers in order to win victories that would bolster the legitimacy of their claim in the imperial centre. The campaigns of 367 to 369, called the First Gothic War of Valens, were successful and brought the Gothic leaders to terms with Valens, allowing him to refocus on other objectives in the east. This set the scene for the later events of 376 AD, when a large group of Gothic refugees consisting of two tribal groups, the Dervingi, led by an Arian Christian convert named Fritigern, and the Gruthungi, reached the frontier of the Roman Empire at the Danube, now fleeing from the Huns to the Roman frontier. According to the Greek historian Zosimus, writing in the later Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century, the Goths were compelled to leave their habitations to these Huns and crossing the Ister, which is an archaic name for the Danube, to supplicate the emperor to receive them on their promises to adhere to him as faithful soldiers. Ammianus writes too how, sending envoys to the emperor, they begged to be received, promising that they would not only leave a peaceful life, but would also furnish auxiliaries, so in exchange for being allowed to settle on the land within the protection of the Roman limes, they would become clients of the Roman state and provide the emperor's soldiers for a planned war with Persia over a matter of the Armenian throne. Agreeing to this proposal, the emperor granted permission for the Goths to settle in Thrace, and so at the Danube they were ferried over for some nights and days, embarked by companies in boats, on rafts, and in hollowed tree trunks. And in this quote from Ammianus, we can see by the time it takes them to cross the river the perceived size of this migration. After which, Ammianus tells us the emperor gave orders that they should be given food for their present needs and fields to cultivate. We can see how these events provided broad strokes inspiration to the narrative of the A Song of Ice and Fire books, with the settled, familiar wildlings north of the wall being set in motion by the emerging threat of the others. Like the others, Kulikowski talks about how the Huns seemed very different from and much more frightening than the Alans, the group who had been the Roman world's previous prototypical idea of steppe nomads. Wanting to settle behind the protection of the militarized frontier, the wildlings first attempt to breach the wall and then are defeated in battle by the Night's Watch Stannis, who is the figure most equivalent to Valens in this narrative, and later make a deal with both parties, which is that they will be allowed to settle on the gift where they can sustain themselves on more fertile land and gain the protection of the wall, in exchange for taking on feudal obligations to him, in the hopes that they will provide him soldiers for a more important conflict. In Valens' case, the war against Persia, and in Stannis' case, the war for the Iron Throne and the larger Manichaean millennial conflict he believes himself to be the protagonist of. We can see the similarity between the grouping of several tribes, Dervingi and Gruthungi, into the general Gothi, with the grouping of the different and diverse wildling clans, Thens, Ice River clans, Hornfoots, into the generic wildlings, and even in the suggested etymology of the Dervingi, meaning tree people or forest people, people from the wild. A large part of the Night's Watch and Stannis' plotlines in A Dance with Dragons is dealing with the wildling migration, and it's filled with late Roman tropes. The use of barbarian tribes as auxiliaries, the conversion of pagan peoples en masse to a new religion, and the role of the king or emperor as an apocalyptic millennial religious figure. The settlement of the Goths in 376 AD, however, was not the mutually beneficial solution that it initially promised to be. Mistreatment at the hands of Roman officials incited the Goths, led by Fritigern, to a rebellion inside the empire. Kulikowski tells us how Roman officials created an artificial food crisis in order to sell rations that should have been distributed as part of the resettlement, settlers resorting to dog meat at the price of one dog for every Gothic child enslaved. According to Ammianus, the Goths muttered that they were being forced to disloyalty as a remedy for the evils that would threaten them. The immediate precipitating incident that turned unrest into rebellion occurred when panicked Roman officials arrested and murdered Gothic leaders at a banquet in Marcellinus after a violent incident involving their followers in the city. Fritigern, the leader of the Thervingi, was arrested but released with hopes of calming the Gothic reaction which broke out after the Goths, believing that their leaders had been slain under pretense of friendly entertainment, had blazed out into turbulence. Fritigern, rejoining his followers, entered open rebellion. Ammianus tells us the whole nation of the Thervingi was fired with ardour for battle. In the later parts of the latest mainline A Song of Ice and Fire book, A Dance with Dragons, we see the next stages of the Wildling migration plotline being developed. In the 5th John chapter, the Lord Commander visits the Wildlings settled at Molestown to distribute food, and we see the tension brewing over the amount that is being provisioned them, and the Thens are particularly singled out as a potential locus of discontent. John spends another chapter reviewing the Night's Watch food supplies, which are found to be inadequate, and later negotiates a loan from the Iron Bank to purchase food from the south. One of the key grievances of Burn Marsh, who is the Lord Steward of the Night's Watch and the highest-ranking known member of the conspiracy to kill Jon Snow at the end of A Dance with Dragons, is the effect the new wildling population will have on their food supplies for the coming winter. All this shows how key the issue of food and impending famine has already been shown to be in the fictional narrative. Martin is using the grievances of the Goths after their settlement in 376 AD to establish the same kind of reaction as the next event in the plotline, a wildling rebellion south of the Wall. In the closing John chapter of A Dance with Dragons, the chronologically latest published material with perspective on this plotline, and so what can be considered the immediate present in the world of the story, we see also a similar inciting incident taking place or being set up to take place imminently. The leaders of the Wildlings south of the Wall have gathered at the Shield Hall in Castle Black and are feasting and drinking at the time of Jon Snow's assassination by the conspirators, including Burn Marsh. Simultaneously, the wildling giant Won is involved in some kind of violent incident at Harden's Tower. Whatever happens in the immediate aftermath of Jon Snow's assassination, it will almost certainly involve some kind of violent response against the wildlings who are perceived as a threat by the plotters, including the mass arrest or killing of the wildlings at the Shield Hall, who have just moments ago affirmed their support for Jon Snow. And furthermore, because of Burn Marsh's involvement, we will also likely see the cessation of provision of food to the wildlings, worsening the existing food crisis. In the Winds of Winter chapters that follow, we will see how these events serve as a catalyst for the wildlings, unhappy with their treatment at the hands of Night's Watch and royal officials, to break out into open rebellion, spreading to the wildlings settled in various places around the north, including those already garrisoning castles on the Wall. Now that the parallel has reached the end of the published material for A Song of Ice and Fire, we must assess whether this historical period is likely to continue to provide inspiration for events in the future titles in this series. To do that, we have to ask why our author has chosen to look at these events in the first place, and whether that will continue to be relevant in future titles. Kulikowski tells us how the events that followed 376 AD have been treated by modern scholars as a decisive marker of Rome's decline and fall. In that context, we can look at the events of the Wildling plotline as part of the decline and fall of Westeros. In fact, just about every destabilizing threat that a pre-modern state could possibly face is being established in Westeros. Civil war, maritime raiders, mercenaries, pretenders to the throne, invasion by barbarians, plague, climatic stress, famine, religious extremism. Even without this supernatural threat, this would be considered apocalyptic times. And so it's no surprise the author is looking to the late Roman period for inspiration. As we'll shortly see, continuing to parallel the events of the 4th century in the northern plotline would pay off the situation that has already been established in a way that exacerbates this sense of collapse and disaster for Westeros. We don't need to trace every detail of the Gothic War that began in 376. What is important for us is the broad strokes outline. From the Thervingi led by Fritigern, the rebellion spread widely amongst other Goths. Kulikowski notes that at this point, sources start referring to the generic Gothi, including slaves and Gothic Roman troops who had received marching orders for the Persian front. Kulikowski calls it a series of small revolts, each with a different trigger, that eventually converged into a threat to the whole region. This new group of Gothic rebels, what Kulikowski calls a field army, won various victories against Roman forces, posing a serious enough threat that Emperor Valens returned from the Persian front to deal with them, raising a new army in Constantinople for the purpose, and also summoned help from the Western Emperor, which by this time was Gratian. Coming upon the Goths near Adrianople, envoys were exchanged. In the Roman camp, sources tell us about the debate over how to proceed. Councillors advised Valens to march forward with his whole army, that the barbarians were almost destroyed, and the emperor might gain a victory without trouble. In the words of Zosimus, Ammianus puts the impetus on Valens. The fatal insistence of the emperor prevailed, supported by the flattering opinion of some of his courtiers, who urged him to make all haste in order that Gratian might not have a share in the victory which, as they represented, was already all but won. During this period of waiting, Kulikowski tells us the Roman troops languished in the sun, and the Goths lit fires that sent choking clouds of smoke towards their lines. While tactical details cannot be reconstructed with any precision from Ammianus' account, we know that fighting started accidentally when 2 Roman units advanced prematurely on the right wing, which disordered the Roman line of battle. What followed was a disaster. The surrounded Romans were so crowded together that hardly anyone could pull out his sword or draw back his arm. Ammianus puts it simply, the annals record no such massacre of a battle except the one at Cannae. Among the dead was the Emperor Valens. Zosimus gives an account of how he fled into an unfortified village. The barbarians therefore surrounded the place with a quantity of wood, which they set on fire. All who had fled thither, together with the inhabitants, were consumed in the flames, and in such a manner that the body of the emperor could never be found. This story is called romantic by Kulikowski, but he does note that, whatever the case, Valens's body was never found. Whatever its veracity, the story has become part of the mythology surrounding Adrianople. Ammianus foreshadows this death of the emperor by telling us prior to the battle it became usual that whoever thought that he was suffering wrong shouted without restraint, "Let Valens be burnt alive." All this, almost in plain speech, showed that this kind of death threatened him, and the smoke and fire which choked the field prior to battle also easily slide in as narrative omens of this conclusion. By now you have no doubt traced the implication. We've seen the parallel between the wall and the Roman limes. We've seen the parallel between Stannis and the Night's Watch allowing the entry of Wildlings into the realm and Valens settling the Goths. And we've seen the parallel between the crises at the end of A Dance with Dragons and the factors that precipitated the Gothic rebellion in 376 AD. So if these events continue to provide inspiration in the Winds of Winter, I believe we will see a rebellion of wildlings south of the wall, which Stannis will meet in battle and be destroyed by in a manner similar to the Roman army at Adrianople, an engagement in which Stannis will be killed by fire and his body never found. Mechanically, this makes sense as a plot point for the Winds of Winter. Stannis is currently somewhere outside Winterfell preparing for battle, with the Bolton-led forces occupying it. The impending battle, which is called the Battle of Ice by fans. Although in the TV adaptation, this is the battle that kills Stannis, there's something of a consensus among the book fans that Stannis may well survive and prevail over the Bolton-led forces. Assuming that is the case, he's going to be in Winterfell at the head of a coalition of Northern Stark loyalists and Southern Knights for some interval of time, posing of matters there, after which at some point he is going to want to return to the wall for his new seat at the Night Fort along with his wife and Melisandre, putting him directly into the most logical path of a wildling force heading south for plunder and better conditions. When Stannis gets word of the Wildling Rebellion, his court's presence at the wall will give him all the more reason to head north and confront them directly, a move which will be strongly encouraged by both political imperatives, his whole northern strategy thus far having been premised around defeating the traditional enemies of the northerners to rally them to his cause, which will only be more important if further northern lords join him after the Battle of Ice, and personal drives, not only to rescue his dependents at the wall, but also from previous examples of Stannis' character we can imagine a strong motivation for him to punish the wildlings for breaking faith with him, couched in terms of feudal obligations. This therefore puts Stannis' force after Winterfell on a direct course for collision with the wildling rebels somewhere between Winterfell and Castle Black. Can we now speculate about how that will play out based on the historical Battle of Adrianople? There are good reasons to see similarities. Firstly, we would likely see some attempt to negotiate prior to battle being joined. This is a pretty standard trope with medieval pitched battles, perhaps less so in A Song of Ice and Fire, but where we did see it used prominently was the meeting at Storm's End, where Stannis negotiated with Renly prior to an expected pitched battle there. The same incentives to negotiate prior to battle exist here. In this scenario, Stannis has little to actively gain in exchange for hazarding both his own manpower and the potential future manpower the wildlings might provide. So if he's able to restore order and enact his idea of justice on the ringleaders, with a negotiated settlement of some kind, there would be a strong reason to attempt that. One thing we also saw in Adrianople was a religious component to this pre-battle parley. Fritigern was an Arian Christian convert, and the envoys he sent to the emperor were priests, and similarly, a large part of the Wildlings have at least notionally converted to the faith of Relor, and Sigorn, the Magnor of Then, who is one possible leader of the Wildling rebels, was married in a ceremony of that religion. Therefore, like Adrianople, we may well see a period of negotiations before the battle, and if so, that might be carried out under the banner of the Lord of Light. After the death of Valens, what's probably most well known about Adrianople is the previously mentioned smoke from Gothic-lit fires that clouded the battlefield and, at least according to some narratives, was influential in the Roman defeat. Though this may seem like a superficial detail, there is at least some reason to believe this will also be the case in the Winds of Winter. Smoke was previously a prominent sign of the approaching Wildlings when they burnt Molestown on the way to attack Castle Black from the south, and Stannis himself has faced this before when Tyrion's mountain Wildlings burned the Kingswood ahead of his march to the Blackwater. Tyrion supposedly tells Cersei Stannis had better train his horses to eat ash. If they employ such tactics again prior to battle with Stannis, burning down either forests or a yet unnamed village ahead of Stannis' march, his forces would be choked by smoke like the Romans at Adrianople as they await the result of negotiations. There would also be an element of dark irony in having Stannis, the champion of the faith of Relor which venerates fire, encountering fire as an obstacle in the time of his greatest peril, an effect previously employed by the author in the Battle of the Blackwater, with the previously mentioned burning of the Kingswood and most apparently the use of wildfire symbolically coinciding with Stannis' attack on King's Landing. From now on then, I will refer to this hypothetical fictional battle as the Battle of Smoke to differentiate it from the historical Battle of Adrianople, in keeping with the naming scheme that has been established by fans for the other anticipated battles in the Winds of Winter. Parallels to the factors that led to the defeat at Adrianople have already been established in the previous books. We know Stannis is a competent strategist, but what the author has repeatedly stressed both directly and indirectly is that he is not a good leader. Almost every council he has held throughout the series has been plagued by conflict, and his actions are often dictated by a need to hold together his various forces, lacking in the unifying personal appeal of either of his brothers to instill loyalty. On examination of his previous military record, we see Stannis has won all his best victories when he's in a position of disadvantage, usually with some unexpected lateral move, subterfuge, or surprise attack. Holding out against the Tyrells at Storm's End, using smugglers to supply the castle, a pincer movement to beat the Ironborn at sea at Fair Isle, luring Renly into Storm's End to remove him as a rival and to take possession of his forces, attacking the Wildlings who have 20 times his numbers from their side of the wall instead of going through Castle Black. And finally, if Stannis does survive the Battle of Ice at the start of the Winds of Winter, as many suspect, it will likely be through a ruse or trap of some kind. When Stannis has his best advantage on the Blackwater, however, he receives his worst defeat. We have reason to believe that the same outcome will play out here. Having a larger, better disciplined force, there will be several pressures for him to engage quickly instead of waiting for reinforcements. The purpose of Stannis' campaign in the north is to win publicizable victories in order to lend legitimacy and momentum to his cause, and so, like Valens, he will have an incentive to make haste and join battle without reinforcements, and this political necessity for a victory would dovetail with the personal drives of the men under his command. Martial ardour, overwhelming strategic reasoning, embodied in characters like Godfrey Ferring and Imry Florent. We have seen this theme explored over and over again in A Song of Ice and Fire, when men whose particular self-image and personal narrative surrounding ideas of glory leads them into inadvisable actions, such as those which could precipitate a premature engagement, much as happened at Adrianople. Moreover, given the nature of forces under Stannis' command, there will be a tendency among his advisors to overestimate their advantage. In this way, the battle will be a repeat of the Blackwater. Having just won an unlikely victory and gained a number of new allies, Stannis will be forced to go out and win another victory to appease them. A situation the potential presence of Rickon Stark will only exacerbate. Though only a child, he is famously uncontrollable, and for the northern commanders he will be looked to as a symbol of Stark revanchism, which could therefore make him a locus of agitation for military engagement with the Wildlings, in extension of the attitudes we have already seen from the Northern Lords marching against Winterfell, who desire to bathe in Bolton blood. Finally, the shared contempt the Seven Kingdoms forces have for the Wildling savages, and their perceived lack of discipline, the personal insult and threat felt by the Northerners on whose land they're on, and the memory of their previous defeat at the hands of a much smaller southern force, will only exacerbate their overestimate of the advantage their force has. With all these pressures taken together, we can see Stannis' council prior to battle will look startlingly like Valens' prior to Adrianople, advisors presenting the battle as already won, leading to a premature engagement. For Stannis, giving into overconfidence and conventional thinking precedes disaster. The exact course of the Battle of Smoke after this is unnecessary to speculate on, starting without cavalry, one deciding factor of Stannis' last battle against the Wildlings, the following loss of discipline, which has been stressed previously as a key factor in defeating Wildlings, would more than likely lead to a rout. This brings us to the death of Stannis Baratheon, who, like any self-respecting medieval king, will be leading his forces in person. Though we've already noted that Kulikowski called the story of Valens' death by burning romantic, as in possibly embroidered for the sake of drama, the validity of the story as a historical account is here less important than its potential for creative inspiration. If Stannis' story ends in a similar way to Valens, it would be the climax of a darkly ironic motif that started at the Battle of the Blackwater. Stannis is the champion of R'hllor and perhaps an archetypal chosen one. However, like always in Martin's work, we find a disconnect between the fantasy tropes the characters use to interpret and narrativize events, and the events themselves, which often prove to be more complicated. R'hllor is a fickle god, and being his chosen one is a dangerous business, it seems. On the Blackwater, when Stannis was closest to victory in the War of the Five Kings, but had left behind his link to R'hllor Melisandre, it is fire that stands as his obstacle, and fire that stops just short of dooming him. I think this is another clue that Stannis' quest for the throne is fated for disaster. Instead of pulling away, Stannis has plunged again into his own pursuit of the throne and his imagined narrative role as the chosen one, the champion of R'hllor, a tragic decision which this time will consume him entirely. And of course, R'hllor is not the only god in Westeros. Burning Stannis would also be a religious revenge for the Wildlings, who were forced to burn weirwood branches as a sign of submission to Stannis. And most interestingly, the death of Stannis specifically by burning could possibly have significant magical implications. According to the rules previously established, burning a king would be an extremely potent magic sacrifice. What effects the force unleashed by this might have on the world, I will leave to the listener to speculate on. We've already spoken about how parallels to the late Roman period are thematically important to the larger narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire, and Stannis' death at the Battle of Smoke would be the culmination of that. From the start, Stannis' plan for a campaign on the northern frontier to win victories against barbarians that would legitimize his claim to leadership is archetypally Roman. His potential defeat at the hands of Wildlings would mirror the way Adrianople marked a decisive shift in the relationship between the Roman Empire and the peoples beyond its border. So in a broader sense, Stannis is being set up to play the archetype of the doomed king or the doomed emperor, identified with characters like Valens or King Arthur. He represents the last remnant of the political settlement of the summer, as Robert's true heir and the last hope of the dynasty. His cause and ideals are underpinned by the assumptions of the time before the disaster, and so in the apocalyptic revolutionary times of A Song of Ice and Fire must be fated for a tragic fall. For further confirmation that this is the archetypal role that Stannis is playing in the story, we can digress briefly to look at Stannis' parallels with other historical figures, which indicate that they may have provided inspiration for Stannis not necessarily as a character, but as a fictional historical figure. The first of these is the most often cited historical parallel for the whole A Song of Ice and Fire series, that is with the English civil wars of the 15th century called the Wars of the Roses. Relevant to this video is the similarity between the three Baratheon brothers, Robert, Stannis and Renly, and correspondingly the three sons of Richard, Duke of York, those being King Edward IV, King Richard III, and George, Duke of Clarence. As well as a similar family structure and personalities, we can see that Stannis' claim to the Iron Throne, based around the illegitimacy of his elder brother's sons, resembles closely Richard III's accession to the throne of England by declaring the two sons of his elder brother, Edward IV, illegitimate. The story of King Richard III and the heirs of Edward IV, dubbed the Princes in the Tower, after their imprisonment in and subsequent disappearance from the Tower of London, is doubtless one of the most well-known in English medieval history. Richard III's later death in battle at Bosworth signified not only the termination of the House of York and the Plantagenet dynasty, but in the eyes of some historians, the end of the Middle Ages in England. The other key aspect to Stannis' storyline, his relationship with Melisandre and the faith of R'hllor, takes clear inspiration from the well-known story of the Russian mystic Rasputin and his relationship with the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, and his family. In both cases, a charismatic spiritual figure is able to gain influence over the ruler through a relationship with his wife and through a perceived ability to ameliorate the chronic health condition of the royal heir. And in both cases, the spiritual figure is the subject of sexual fascination and attendant gossip of that nature. What is relevant to this discussion is the fate of the historical personage the author chose to model Stannis on. Tsar Nicholas II's abdication and subsequent murder at the hands of Bolshevik revolutionaries marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and the Tsarist period in Russia. In both cases, the historical figure the author has chosen to inspire Stannis is a doomed king, suggesting that as a ruler he will be a transitional figure whose defeat will mark not just a personal tragedy but the end of an entire political and social order. When we look at not just Stannis' plotline in isolation, but the whole ensemble of characters and locations, we can see that A Song of Ice and Fire is the drama of not just one character or even many separate characters, but a drama of the whole world, the whole civilization. These kind of world-ending stakes are a common trope of the fantasy genre. However, what's so interesting about A Song of Ice and Fire is the way it explores social and political collapse as historical processes, and in doing so, the author raises all kinds of questions about our own real-world history. What does it look like when a civilization is in peril? What are the threats? Just how resilient or fragile are the structures that comprise it? And most importantly, how do people living through these events experience and interpret them? It's no wonder that Martin then has looked to the fall of the Roman Empire to provide one example of what the answers might be. Like the Roman Empire, the in-progress fall of Westeros isn't going to be a magical thunderclap, a single event experienced by everyone simultaneously and evenly, but rather an incremental process that will affect different characters to varying degrees, and to some might not be apparent at all. But just like Valin's the death of King Stannis in battle at the hands of barbarians from beyond the frontier will be a watershed moment, important as a visible signifier of just how far the realm has fallen. The smoke that rises from this battle signals not just the fiery downfall of one king, but a point of no return for the old social and political structures for which the long-promised winds of winter sound the death knell.